Good morning, everybody. I'm Professor Emma Johnston, ecologist and ecotoxicologist at the University of New South Wales and Director of the Sydney Harbour Research Program for the Sydney Institute of Marine Science. I'm also Vice President of STA and a very proud card-carrying member of that organisation. Well, what a week in politics, what a month, what a year, we could say. The really exciting thing about Science Meets Parliament is it's always held in a sitting week of Parliament, which means there's always some action, and you're going to see that in person tomorrow. The downside of that is that there's always quite a few competing activities and interests and quite a few competing actors, and many of them appear to be going for a Grammy. So we are only one voice amongst many. And one of the things that I've learned over the years as a scientist, and one of the hardest things I've had to learn, is that despite the fact we argue that we have a very strong voice, and we should have a very strong voice, because our methods, our techniques, our practices create better reflections of reality. The technologies, the medicines, the engineering that we do all underpin current modern society. We are creating evidence despite all of that, despite the fact that many politicians argue that they would like to do evidence-based decision-making. The very fact is that evidence does not vote. People vote, and they vote based on their values, and only some of those values are based on evidence or influenced by evidence. So the fantastic lineup we have this morning of speakers are people who have a great deal of experience making sure that scientific evidence gets in front of a huge range of audiences. That includes the general public, it includes specific groups within society, but it also includes the politicians themselves who vote in both Houses of Parliament based on their very strong values. And so this morning we have people from a range of organisations with a range of experience. The first panel this morning are very much journalists and media people, but they actually have I was going to say a really long history, but I don't want to say they're all old. Look at them, they look great. They're led by the very talented Kylie Walker, who's going to chair the morning session. Kylie is Director of Communications for the Australian Academy of Science, and we all know that the Australian Academy of Science represents our fellows, some of our brightest stars in Australian science, but they also have the remit of promoting the public communication of science. And Kylie is in charge of that, both internally and externally. Kylie has a very long, lengthy career. She's esteemed in both strategy, in media and in advocacy. She's joined today by Carabine, political editor for Radio National's breakfast program. So Ali has just switched off the mic at Radio National and dashed across Canberra, and it takes a long time to get across Canberra when it's raining. And also by James Massola, who's Fairfax political correspondent in the Canberra Bureau. And they're going to talk to us this morning about what they need for them to be able to turn our science into news, and a few other hot tips. So please welcome them to the stage.
Thanks very much, Emma. You know, a robust news media is very important to the healthy running of a democracy, and it's certainly very active in this country. We have an extremely busy federal press gallery, and Alison Carabine and James Massola are two of the more esteemed members, we won't say long-standing. I worked in newsrooms for about a decade before I crossed to the dark side and started doing public relations, communications and advocacy. And I thought during that decade that was how all workplaces worked. And I realised once I left them that it's not at all how all workplaces work. There's a very interesting and I would say even unique culture in the media. And I think what we'd like to do this morning is talk very briefly about what it's like to work in a newsroom, but then to talk more broadly about how news participates in or is a part of the political process, and how you might be able to hook into that cycle in order to influence hearts and minds, which is, as Emma said, a very important part of getting things done and affecting political change. So I'm going to start by asking you, James, to briefly describe what your day is like.
Sure. Okay. Hi again. As Kylie said, I work for the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age as the political correspondent. Really quickly, I've been in the gallery for about 8 years, and news has changed a lot in that time in terms of what the expectations are for when we file stories and what those stories should look like, what they should cover. So my day generally starts at about 6 a.m. when I, if I don't sleep through my alarm, I read the papers. News radio at 6:50 usually has the first political interview of the day. I then go back to the papers. I then listen to Ali's show at 7:30. It's one of the biggest political interviews, or most important ones, is on there. 8 a.m. there is the second edition of AM, which is on another ABC station, which usually also has an important interview. I then walk into the office. On the walk in on the way to work, I make sort of 3 or 4 calls, always to Abbott's office and Shorten's office, and then a couple of others, discuss what the day ahead looks like, what the other papers have, what we have. I've usually listed a story or two in our news planner, which is kind of like a networked version of Microsoft Word, if you like. It's a bit more sophisticated than that, but we can see across the 5 sites, which are obviously Sydney, Melbourne, Canberra, Brisbane and WA, our 5 sort of main publication sites, what people are working on over the course of the day. And then I get in and sort of start making calls. There's usually an interview on Sky. If it's a sitting day in particular, there'll be doorstops and press conferences in the in the courtyards or up in the mural hall. Usually the PM and Bill Shorten will do doorstops roughly around mid-morning, which ensures that they get into the sort of, at the very least, into the evening news cycle. If there's question time, then there might be a grab or a line or an angle that they're trying to push that they'll also hammer in question time. Sort of through the course of the day, on a sitting day, I reckon I would file somewhere between 2 and 4 stories each day. Some of those I'll make a call in consultation with the editors that they should be web first. Fairfax is very much a digital first company these days. The statistics are amazing and very sort of precise about who reads what, when and at what times. So we'll try and hit stories at sort of 9 a.m, midday, 4 p.m, 6 p.m and 8 p.m. You get different sorts of traffic at those times. Like there's a lot of Facebook traffic. People are relaxing after dinner at 8 p.m. So we'll try and do a website update around that time with some decent stories, hopefully decent stories. But you also kind of have to make a call about, well, what does tomorrow's front page look like? So if the PM gives a press conference at 10 a.m. and says, I announce we're funding an extra $100 million for such and such a scientific project, that needs to go online. It would be great if he did.
Might go the other way, James.
Well, indeed, at the moment. If that happens, then we'll sort of quickly file that doesn't hold till tomorrow. You file that immediately. What you do need to do then is value add and say, well, what does this mean? What does the opposition say? What does the science sector say? What are the budgetary implications for this? Did the PM roll Joe Hockey over this because Hockey said he doesn't want to spend any more money on science? Not that he has, but in theory. So you've got to work the angles through the day and think, what's the story now, but what's the story 12 hours from now? Hopefully on the front page. That's where you're sort of always aiming to end up. It doesn't always work out like that. I guess that's a sort of a brief rundown of my day.
So it's very, very busy. It's always moving, and you've got to stay in touch with things throughout the day as they develop. And I guess I wanted to just emphasise that point because it speaks to the deadline of the journalist. Now, I know science is a discipline or a range of disciplines that moves sometimes very, very slowly. We're talking about decades rather than minutes, whereas with journalism, and for you as well, Ali, there's often a deadline of minutes. Can you talk us through your day?
Well, I'm utterly exhausted listening to James talk us through his day. It's quite extraordinary. It just sums up how intense working in the federal political sphere can be. My focus is very similar to James, but my working day is slightly differently structured. I start my working day in the witching hour because we go to air at 6 o'clock in the morning. That necessitates a very early start, but you do get used to it, so I don't know how long it's sustainable. I would normally be in the office in Parliament House by about, between 3 and 4 a.m, but I'm very robust. I've survived so far. And my day pretty much goes all through the day. Of course, it's not as intense as James, so I don't have to be quite on top of things as James is, but the competition for political content, political interviews is so red hot these days because there are so many platforms delivering the same sort of product that you have to be on the ball and you cannot drop the ball anytime during the day. So what I would be doing at 3 o'clock in the morning, I would have already read the newspapers, so I would know what is fresh in the papers for us to chase. But normally, my day's a bit topsy-turvy. I chase the interviews for Fran. Fran Kelly's the host of Radio National Breakfast. My job is political editor, for fancy name for the chick who works in an office in Parliament House in Canberra. But it's my job to source all the political content, and we are a politics-heavy program. Politics, economics, business and science and the environment. That's the ballast for RN Breakfast. We're a fairly serious program. So I would chase my interviews in the afternoon and the evening, but then not write them until the following morning, hence the very early start. So if I'm in at 3 o'clock, I'd spend a couple of hours writing 2 or 3 interviews, trying to do a fairly comprehensive job, writing a couple of different commentaries that get inserted across the program. Once we're on air, I'll start chasing fresh stories. Now, in one sense, my working day is over at 9 a.m. So I can go to the pub or I can just keep working.
Or you can come here and share your
Or
wisdom.
I can drive through heavy Canberra traffic. I can't believe I used those words in the same sentence to speak with you lovely people. But you just cannot stop. Divert your attention, divert your focus, because, as I say, there is so many different programs now crowding out the space that we work in, and the competition is so hot that you just have to keep tuned in the whole day. So across the course of the day, it's a matter of reading transcripts of press conferences, doorstops, speeches, watching Question Time and so forth, and like James is doing, casting forward to the next day. What is going to be of interest to our listeners the following day?
Now, I want to delve into that a little bit deeper. James mentioned that your program often sets the tone for his work in the morning. I know that our next panel session is about how you rise above that clamour of the 400 or so professional lobbyists that might work in Canberra on any given day. Obviously, an important part of that is to find a voice in the media with the public. How do you go about deciding which stories you're going to focus on?
Well, it's very incestuous. If James is listening to our interviews to pick up on leads for Fairfax, we're reading his newspapers and reading James's content and the stories that he breaks that we might want to pursue on Radio National Breakfast. So you should be doing a panel on incest, because that's how the media works. We all feed off each other, Kylie.
That's a charming image, thank you.
Yeah. It's true though, and I mean the point is, you have to keep a very close watching brief on everything that's being said, but if you're doing your job well, and I'm sure Ali would agree, you're also trying to think of what do people not know, what can I surprise them with, what do they not know that they need to know that I can bring to the table, to the website or to the newspaper, and sort of start a new conversation about a new area. So when you're making a judgment about what a story, what's worth doing a story on, you've got to sort of factor in how interesting is this to people? Do people actually know it? Is this going to sell papers? Although that, I guess, for us is not necessarily in Canberra the primary sort of consideration, because there's also kind of a national interest test, which I really like. It's one of the things I love about working in Canberra, is that we do pretty serious stories that come from all across the country and across all fields.
So what is it that makes, and I want to give you 2 examples from my work in the last year or so, what is it that makes a story on NCRIS, the National Research Infrastructure, worth covering, and it got pretty good coverage, and why is it that a story on, for example, an endangered ecosystem on the outskirts of Melbourne won't get coverage?
Well, I think NCRIS is a very good example, because it had a number of very important strains to it, because not only was the story of terrific merit in itself, that the government was holding the NCRIS funding over a barrel, and that 1,700 scientists' jobs were at quite extreme risk of being wiped out if indeed the government pursued its incredibly ideologically driven approach to science in this country. But it was also linked to the higher education funding. So it was almost a perfect storm, which made it a not just an important story, but an interesting story. And we, on Radio National Breakfast, I was given the opportunity to interview Brian Schmidt. Kylie's people helped organise that interview. And of course we couldn't turn down an interview with a Nobel laureate about an issue as important as all of this money. It wasn't a huge amount of money, but it was enough money to keep a number of scientists doing their very important work. And it was the funding itself, it was the higher education reforms, and then you throw in Brian Schmidt and it's just a magical mix. And I think we did one of the first interviews. This story, Christopher Pyne was threatening this funding, I think, back in October last year. But it didn't really start getting some momentum until the vote in the Senate was looming on the higher education. And indeed, people in the scientific community were facing the very realistic threat of losing their jobs.
And from the perspective of the Research Alliance, which did coordinate the media side of that campaign, we had spent some time, Brian and others had spent some time speaking with politicians before we ever brought it to the public gaze. And our approach is to try and do that respectfully and behind closed doors. Once it became clear that that wasn't working, we decided that we needed to enlist the help of the public, essentially. Yep. And that is through the media. It was also through social media. And it was also not only by having high-profile speakers like Brian, like Katrina, like Les Field, who's our Secretary for Science Policy at the Academy, but also through telling the stories of some of the work that was being done at NCRIS facilities and allowing the researchers themselves to come forward and talk about the work that they're doing and why it matters not only to the economy but to individual Australians.
Yeah, look, that's a really important point, because we were lining up another interview with a scientist at the forefront, at the coalface, whose staff were already tendering their resignations and looking for jobs elsewhere. We didn't proceed with that interview because Christopher Pyne announced his back down. So we went back to Brian Schmidt because he was still a very valued contributor to our program now that the government had backed down. But that would have been the next interview that we were going to do. Someone who could talk about her project and why it mattered, and why it mattered a great deal if that project ended.
So there are a lot of people doing a lot of important work across a lot of different industries and jobs. What is it that, James, that differentiates the people who you might choose to interview? What is it that makes you decide between somebody over here who says what I do is really important and somebody over here who says what I do is really important? What makes it a good story or a good interview?
Conflict plays a part. People, conflict drives stories. If it bleeds, it leads. It's a sad reality, but it is the reality to some extent. But there are other tests, Kylie. I mean, the worthiness of a story. And to go back to the story you've just been talking about, there was in that story a human angle, there was a policy angle, and there's also a sort of a party political angle. Now, Pyne is one of the PM's strong supporters. He's one of the most senior members of the government, and he massively miscalculated, and this against a backdrop of a government that's been in trouble, a Prime Minister who's already faced and narrowly seen off a spill motion. I mean, as Ali kind of says, it's a perfect storm. It was a perfect storm for a good story out of Canberra. Sometimes it's hard to know what a good story is. I mean, for example, I've got 4 that I'm sort of working on today. One of them is on Australia, China, and the trade relationship in the last year. It's an annual report that'll come out tomorrow. Now, that might not end up being a story, but is it significant to the Australian economy? Is it something that we should all be thinking about and talking about? The shift from the mining boom to how Australia plugs into global manufacturing supply chains. What are the opportunities for the economy? Yes, that's a very important story. Now, that's not necessarily a sexy story, but it's one that I think is important. So I'll do the interviews today, and maybe it won't be a page one, but it'll certainly get a run somewhere because it's actually stuff that I think that people need to know. And
certainly with this government as well, that it's been a very clear indication that an economic story and a productivity story is one that they want to hear as well.
Yep.
So you've mentioned one very important thing. Sorry, Ali, you were about to...
I just wanted to add to what James has said. I mean, ultimately, what makes a good story, the judgment that you make is it of interest to our readers and to our listeners? if you've got two competing potential stories, of course each person thinks what they're doing is very important and is very interesting, but the ultimate judge are consumers.
And I work with a very talented media officer who is also a former press gallery journalist, Bella Coonahan, and she's a great storyteller. But one of the things that she always looks for when we think we've got something that might be newsworthy is what's in it for me. It's kind of what you're saying, but flipping it, I guess. What's in it for me? Why should I care about this particular bit of research or this particular bit of endangered reef, for example?
I kind of think about it in terms of we don't write the headlines, but I sort of think, what's the headline on this? If I'm trying to tell, if I go home at night and I'm trying to tell my fiance or my mum or whatever what this story is about, what's the headline? What's the first part? They're the sort of two tests for me as a starting point. And if they're interesting, then that means that it probably matters to more people than just me. It's not a slightly obscure thing that no one really cares about. That's a pretty good way of sort of testing it. How would I explain this to my mum in one paragraph?
Yeah. I want to just change our focus a little bit and talk about the political process and the media's role in that. How do politicians try to use the media, and are they successful?
Well, it's their raison d'etre, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, politicians use the media like the media, I guess, try to use politicians to obtain content because we're all after stories. Of course, politicians try to use the media every day. The Prime Minister's office, from the Prime Minister's office down, they would be working out their daily itinerary, their daily schedule, all based around the media cycle. And often, I'm surprised that it doesn't happen a little more often with our program, but politicians do approach newspapers, they drop stories, they approach broadcast outlets like RN Breakfast and obviously offer themselves up. I like to think that whenever I ring a politician and say, hi, would you like to come on air and talk to Fran? They say, yeah, because they like Fran, and I ask politely. It doesn't work that way. They use us as much as we might try to use them. A politician will only do an interview if there is something in it for him or her.
Yeah. The other point to make, of course, there is that they might be scared of Fran because she's pretty damn good at her job.
They're
not going to get an easy ride, right?
No, I'm not.
So that is a factor, though. I mean, I actually ran an analysis over the weekend, which we published yesterday in the papers, of the comparative media strategies of Abbott in 2011, his first full year as opposition leader after an election, and Shorten in 2014. Now, I counted, I think it was 457 interviews that Abbott did in 2011, which is more than one a day. It's an extraordinary figure. Shorten's done about 265. Now, there's probably a few variations there, but these are the publicly available, published transcripts of these interviews. What was really interesting there is that Abbott spoke to his sort of so-called enemies at the ABC. He's been a sometime critic of the ABC, but he did engage about the same number of times and sit down as Shorten has done so with the ABC. But Shorten has a really clear small target strategy at the moment, wherein he basically won't talk to 2UE in Sydney, he won't talk to 2GB. These are both seen as sort of radio stations that are on the right of the political spectrum. He talks to 3AW in Melbourne a little bit, but that's his hometown station. 4BC, 5AA and 6PR in Perth, those stations don't get much of a run either. And on Breakfast Telly, the sort of most high-profile program, which is the Today Show on Channel 9, Abbott had been on 31 times in 2011. Shorten had been on twice in 2014. Sort of breaking it down, I was discussing it with a professor of political marketing, Andrew Hughes, at the ANU, and he said the clear strategy here is this. Shorten's tactic is to allow Abbott to make the running, to make mistakes, which in the first 18 months or so, he actually has made a few. He gets into the cycle at about midpoint of the day, says, oh, the PM stuffed up here, or Labor wouldn't do that, Abbott should have done this, or Abbott should apologise for that. But he's not actually doing much beyond that. He's a small target. Now, I guess the point of that is, in the short term, that works well for him. Look at the polls. But in the longer term, that actually creates problems for Shorten in the same way that it created problems for Abbott, because people then say, well, what do you stand for? What do you actually believe in? What are your policies? Now, the test for Shorten will be, can he turn that around? Can he actually make himself a larger target, as, say, Kevin Rudd did in 2007 when he launched a whole suite of policies? And this is what we stand for, and then in so doing, win people in a positive way over to Labor's agenda, away from the coalition.
So has the role of the media, I should probably say the relationship between the media and politics changed in recent years?
I think it's just sped up, basically, Kylie. We just look to file. and this goes back to the point before, there are greater demands to file stories during the course of the day, basically. So to look at the front page of a competitor or our own front page and think, that was a cracking front page yarn, how can I take it forward and by midday have an update on that will tell people something new, whether it's just reaction from the opposition or whether it's internal bickering over a particular policy, say the science funding issue we're talking about. Say Julie Bishop yesterday, Ali's program had her on. She said, well, this is the first I've heard about another foreign aid cut. I'll be speaking to the Treasurer about this one. And that sort of dominated the day yesterday, as you may or may not have seen.
Look, the relationship has changed, I think, because I first started in the press gallery about 22 years ago, and at that time, part of my job would have been monitoring what other programs, I was working on commercial radio then, what other programs were broadcasting. But back then, in the mid-90s, you basically had a key interview on Channel 9, 7 o'clock in the morning, then there was AM, and then that was it for the rest of the day until the 6 o'clock news services at night. These days, the marketplace is utterly crowded. Everyone is doing politics, whether it's Sky, ABC 24 and so forth. James's paper, you would have to feed the website continuously, which would make your day even longer. I'm not saying any of the outlets I've just mentioned are this, but there is so much junk media on politics now that some journalists' day, for example at AAP, their whole day is taken up with just monitoring these programs to see who's saying what about what. Whereas previously, when I first started, it was about going out and sourcing your own stories. It was talking to politicians, getting your stories that way. And I remember speaking with Julia Gillard's Chief of Staff, and she half-jokingly was telling me about the Prime Minister's dismay, but how awestruck she was watching Sky one day, and one of the political commentators was Dom Burke, the gardener. Everyone has an opinion about politics, that's fine, but everyone's now got a vehicle to express that opinion.
It's a bit like climate science, really. We're going to take questions from the floor. We have a mic runner. If you'd like to ask a question, please put up your hand. In the meantime, while I'm waiting for people to put up their hands, because I'm sure it will be absolutely overrun, I do want to ask about the role of social media, and I think that has changed, has had an impact on politics and the way that politics is done. I would suggest that perhaps Twitter has sped up the political process and the rise and fall of politicians. Would you agree?
Yeah, totally. And again, I cite Julia Gillard. I mean, she quite famously lamented a couple of years ago that no matter how much time her government spent crafting serious policy, and she stands up to announce it, by the time she finishes speaking, people are already on Twitter asking, well, what's next? And I think social media certainly has its benefits, and it's a valuable tool for journalists to use, and indeed for politicians to get out their message. But it just makes that marketplace even more crowded, and it's harder to sift the substance from the shite.
Sure. And James, you mentioned Facebook, and it sounds like Fairfax is actually writing with the intent of being shared on Facebook. Would that be a fair assessment?
You want to be shared as widely as possible, basically.
Yeah.
I mean, something like 5% of Australians use Twitter, something like 80% of Australians use Facebook.
And a lot of people get their news from Facebook these days.
Precisely. I had a briefing in Washington last December from the political team at Facebook. They have a really, really impressive political team in Washington. One Democrat who worked for Nancy Pelosi, and one a guy who worked for John Boehner, who had some of the most senior members of the leadership team there. And they were sort of saying, look, journalists might all be on Twitter, but everyone else is on Facebook. If you get stories shared on it, essentially it's another avenue to get your stories shared. Just on the point about, what role I think Twitter in particular has had in speeding up the cycle. When I started in the gallery sort of 7 or 8 years ago, a really good story to get was party room meetings on Tuesday. They're actually happening right now, where Labor and the Liberal parties and the National Party kind of get together to discuss the agenda of the week, the legislative program. What are we thinking about this policy or that policy? Back in the day, it was a really good story to get a leak out of one of those party room meetings or one of those caucus meetings. You could hold the story. It wasn't going to get out on social media. It wasn't going to go up on a website. And it was, if it was a decent leak, it was almost a guaranteed front page. These days, we don't even pretend to try and hold these things. It's sort of a race, if the meeting finishes at 11 a.m, to try and get a leak and publish it. confirming it with 2 or 3 sources by midday type thing.
And a lot of it's coming directly from people in the party room, isn't
absolutely.
it? So a lot of stories are being propagated by people who aren't journalists.
Yep.
We do have a question. If you wouldn't mind standing up, telling us who you are, where you're from.
Sure. I'm David, and I come representing the Society of Crystallographers in Australia and New Zealand. My question is coming back to the incest idea, but coming on a different angle.
Oh, good.
I understand that we live in a dictatorship of novelty, and it makes some sense. But I'm interested to see, if you have that incest, how do you get ideas out of the box, and how do you get media and public interest on ideas out of the box? And I've heard about preparation for the next day and 12 hours and 24 hours, but do you do any preparation for 3 days or a week? Because there are interesting things that might need some feed from different areas and will crash in a week's time. And I would like to hear what do you think about that?
No, it's a very good question, because it goes to resourcing the resources that a media outlet will have, because we are so busy just keeping our heads above water, trying to suck in some oxygen and survive the daily cycle, that we don't have an awful lot of time to forward plan. And if we had more resources, we could do it more properly. But that's where the science community or whatever community comes into play. We operate, Planet Canberra is like a biosphere. We all live together, talk together, play together. It's really important to try and break out of that mindset and to be open to new ideas and new stories and so forth. But there's only so much that we can know. We need people to come to us and give us great stories. NCRESS is a perfect example of that. I knew it was bubbling away in the background, but so busy just keeping up with what was happening that day. It needed someone as forceful and with the strategic planning of Kylie and her staff to put that in front of us and say, you need to do this. This is a really important story.
Well, a lot of people working in science don't have someone like me in their staff, so that does make it a little bit more difficult, I think. But perhaps what I'm also hearing is that maybe the Federal Press Gallery isn't always the place to get your stories heard if they're not political stories.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's right. We do a bit of forward planning. You've got to have longer term projects on the go. I mean, I always have a couple of FOIs that I'm fighting with this or that department over, and they can take a month or two to play out, and you just sort of keep them bubbling away. But I would say contact journalists. If you read a particular journalist, say Bridie Smith, our science reporter at The Age, contact her directly and say, look, in 3 months I've got this report. I think it's going to show this. We should talk down the track, that sort of thing. She's going to respect that. She's certainly not going to break any confidences or any embargoes. Just keep in contact with her. I mean, there's a reason why every one of us now, you can click on the name and send us an email, send us a tweet or anything like that, because we really genuinely do want to hear from people. But sort of pick your person, pick your time frame.
Yeah, that's really good advice, but also imagine who you'd be communicating your story to, whether it's the readership of the Sydney Morning Herald or if it's the listeners of RN Breakfast. Remember, we don't all have 7 science degrees. You've got to present your story in a way which is going to be understandable and enjoyable to our consumers.
And I think that the people in this room are going to have some workshops this afternoon on doing just that. I think we have another question over here.
Hi there, Alan Duffy, representing Astronomical Society of Australia. So you mentioned NCRESS being this perfect, bleeding story. It's always going to get attention, bad news story. How do we get positive scientific stories up on the front page, or basically trying to raise the profile of science, but in a positive way? Can we approach you with a story that actually says, hey, we've done something pretty nice here, or if the government funds this, could be even better, as opposed to, oh God, everyone's going to get fired, it'll be a disaster.
Well, I think it's the way James just spoke about, how target your audience, target a science writer. We have a dedicated science spot on RN Breakfast. Friday morning we do science, but it comes out of the UK. He's a fantastic correspondent, but it's from the UK. But don't ever despair. If you find the right person to talk to, pick your program, pick your journalist. We want to run good stories. I can't imagine how many fantastically interesting works are underway in the science sphere, and it would be great if we could give it more coverage.
Yeah, you're really talking about breakthrough stories.
Yeah.
this is what we've actually discovered, this is what we've learned that's new, and this is what it means for people at home, essentially.
Took the words out of my mouth, James. That's exactly right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it is about communicating your work, your new work, in a way that resonates with people who are not scientists, with the everyday person. So we have another question? Oh, here, sorry.
Hi, it's Gary White from Auto CRC Limited. I just liked what you said about the amount of feed you get from Twitter and other leaks and that sort of thing. Maybe there's an application for someone here to develop a computer program like day traders' computer programs to pick up these leaks and get them to you quicker and sort them out for you.
Yeah,
So,
I'd fully support that. That'd be
so
great.
anybody's got an idea there to put that together, that'd
The
be great.
challenge has been put.
Yeah, and then you were talking about junk media, Alison was, and then James was talking about great stories with analysis. Do you think there's an optimal combination which will keep the readership enthused or interested? Because I think obviously too much junk, people get a bit sick and unhealthy. Too much analysis, and they turn away because they've got to think too much about what's going on. Can you give me some
Get rid of
indication?
News Limited?
I think you've picked your audience, Sally.
Yeah, I have no idea how to answer that question. I mean, you've got to have... The point of a good story, and I'm sure you guys would agree, is that it's got to have... you've got to draw people in from the first paragraph, basically. So it can be a kind of a... For lack of a better word, I guess, a sexy intro goes a long way, but it can still be then a meaty story, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Do you make use of junk media to get the story out?
Well, no, I'm just trying to think of an example. I don't think so, no.
I think there are challenges and opportunities in the diversification of media and the democratisation, if I might say, of media. There's an infinite number of possibilities now for people to get their own stories onto the internet, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have a great readership.
Yeah, you might get shunted off into the dead zone. Sunday afternoon television, for example. But look, we are in the media are making a terrible error by underestimating the desire of our audience to learn more about really interesting science stories and scientific breakthroughs.
We've got time for one more question. I think we had a gentleman with the microphone.
Ashley Dunn from the Australian Phenomics Network. Somewhat light-hearted question, goes back to something that Alison said moments ago, which is that what you really want to know is what we want when we listen to radio or watch TV. I can only answer personally, but what I want is some very hard questioning, and Alison, you said that Fran is particularly good at that. I think the bench, the height of the bar was raised when Sarah Ferguson took over from Lee Sales. And I think a lot of us appreciated that what she would not allow politicians that were being interviewed to get away with was to answer the question that they weren't asked. And she kept at them like a terrier. Now, I think one of the challenges that you face is, and when I read the Green Guide on Thursday after Sarah Ferguson had done what I thought was a good job, you got two different sort of letters, one praising her for her aggressive style and saying that's exactly what we want, to not let the politicians get away with it, and yet someone else would use the rudeness word. And I wonder how you... So the question is, how do you approach this? Fran is wonderful, one of my favourite people, but I sometimes think she could go a little bit harder and is in fact sometimes tempted to do so, but the brake is applied.
Yeah, look, thank you, and I'll pass that on to Fran, but it's always a balancing act, because if Fran does, an aggressive interview, it does turn some listeners off, and we're not in the business of losing our listeners. We want to make it a fairly pleasant listening experience in the morning. But it also takes me to, however, that some politicians will not talk to Fran. Tony Abbott, he very, very rarely speaks to our program because he knows he's going to get the run of the kitchen from Fran. Other politicians, they're quite happy to front up because they like our format. Our political interviews, we can stretch them to 9-10 minutes, so we can devote a decent amount of time to them. And there are some politicians who are quite happy to front up and to be grilled by Fran, because they also know that it's going to be a pretty tough interview, but it's going to be an honest interview. We're very upfront about what we want to cover on our program. We don't play gotcha politics. It's not the business that we're in. We're at Radio National, for goodness sake. But I thought Sarah also did a terrific job when she was with 7:30, and it's good to know you're from Melbourne.
Yeah, indeed. For us, like, in newspapers and websites, it's a completely different experience. You know, whenever I've sat down with Tony Abbott or Bill Shorten or Hockey or whoever it might be, I hear myself asking the questions and think how hopeless I am compared to someone like Fran or Sarah. I think they all do a fantastic job, basically. It's sort
I
of
think you do too, James.
Oh yeah, but with a newspaper journalist, when you're doing an interview, you're trying to draw out new information, whereas I think with a radio or TV interview, you're trying to put the politician in question on the spot. And as Ali says, it's kind of, if you can survive those tests, I mean, it's sort of a rite of passage. If you can get through those sort of interviews, you've actually been tested and scrutinised. And, you know,
I think
what you're pushing stands up to scrutiny.
You need a thick skin and you need a quick mind, and both of you have that, and you're both friends of science, and I appreciate your being here today very much. Can you please join me in thanking James and Alison?
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Kylie.
It's time for us to get up.
Okay.